She was told her job was to keep the house spotless, have dinner on the table by 6, and never refuse her husband's needs. The Sears catalog sold matching twin bedroom sets. Women's magazines taught the perfect nightly grooming routine, and Hollywood showed married couples in separate beds as the height of modern sophistication. But behind those floral wallpaper patterns, something far more complicated was happening. Doctors were diagnosing millions of women with a condition they called frigidity, a catch-all term for any wife who didn't perform on command. Marriage manuals instructed husbands that their pleasure was the priority, while wives learned their own satisfaction was never part of the bargain. And then one book appeared, passed from housewife to housewife, read in secret under the covers, that would finally crack the illusion wide open. To understand how millions of women ended up in that situation, you have to understand what the 1950s suburban dream actually promised. It was the peak of the American century, or so the magazines claimed. A nation had survived a depression and won a world war. And now the soldiers were coming home to claim their reward. A steady job, a new house in a freshly built suburb, and a wife who knew exactly how to keep it running. She was the centerpiece of the whole operation. Her smile sold appliances. Her organized kitchen proved her husband's success. Her perfectly behaved children were a walking billboard for the American way of life. And the bedroom, the private space behind that matching twin bedroom set, was supposed to be the engine that kept the whole machine humming. Society had taken the messy, complicated reality of human intimacy and tried to turn it into just another household chore. Medical textbooks were rewritten to define what a normal woman should feel. Marriage counselors published best-selling guides that spelled out exactly how many times a month a wife should submit and how grateful she should be for the opportunity. Film censors erased anything that hinted at genuine desire and replaced it with images of married couples retiring to separate beds like well-behaved siblings. But the strangest part, the part nobody talked about at the time, is that behind those closed doors, something else entirely was brewing. Women had started asking questions they were not supposed to ask, writing letters to a controversial scientist, and passing around information that the establishment wanted buried. And when the truth finally surfaced, it would send a shockwave through every perfectly pressed pillowcase in America. To understand how that shockwave built, you have to step into the world exactly as it was presented to women in the late 1940s and early 1950s. Picture yourself as a young bride, maybe 20 years old. You grew up during the Depression, came of age while the men were overseas, and now the war is over. The message from every direction, magazines, radio, film reels, your own mother, is that your purpose is to create a home. Not just any home, but a sparkling, efficient, modern suburban household that runs like a factory floor. The kitchen is your workstation, the living room is your showroom, and the bedroom, well, that is the one room nobody gives you a straight answer about. You might have glimpsed a wedding night pamphlet handed to you by a blushing aunt, a thin booklet filled with euphemisms about wifely duties and the importance of being patient with your husband's natural urges. What it did not contain, what no official source ever seemed to contain, was any hint that you might have urges of your own, or that the act itself could be anything other than a quiet, slightly embarrassing necessity to be endured with good grace and a freshly scrubbed face. The architects of this new suburban world had designed every detail with intention. The most famous housing development in American history, Levittown, began construction in 1947 on Long Island potato fields. By the early 1950s, thousands of identical houses stretched to the horizon, each one a capsule for the nuclear family. The floor plans were efficient. A small kitchen facing the street so the housewife could watch for her husband's return. A living room with a picture window, and 2 or 3 bedrooms, including the master, which builders furnished with matching twin beds as a selling point. This was not seen as strange. This was advertised as modern, hygienic, progressive. Separate beds meant better sleep, less disturbance, a more civilized marriage. Department stores like Sears and Montgomery Ward devoted entire catalog spreads to the twin bedroom set. His and hers nightstands, his and hers reading lamps, his and hers blankets in complementary shades of rose and gray. The photograph in the catalog showed a smiling couple in coordinated pajamas, a nightstand between them, a lamp on each side. The arrangement looked more like a hotel room for polite siblings than a space for passion. But that was precisely the image the culture wanted to project: domestic life purified of anything messy, anything animal, anything that might suggest women were more than decorative helpmeets. And if you think this was just a furniture trend, consider what was happening in Hollywood at the exact same moment. The Motion Picture Production Code, known as the Hays Code, had been strictly enforced since 1934. It dictated every frame of film that American audiences saw. Under the code, married couples could not be shown in the same bed. Even a shot of a husband and wife sitting on the edge of a mattress together was considered suggestive. Directors had to invent elaborate staging tricks. A couple saying goodnight while standing on opposite sides of twin beds became the standard visual language of marital intimacy. For more than 3 decades, American entertainment taught its audience that proper husbands and wives slept apart, that desire was something that happened off-screen, and that the bedroom was a place for resting, not for anything that might require a closed door and lowered voices. The code shaped not just movies, but the collective imagination. Young women who had never seen a married couple kiss while lying down grew up thinking that was how it was supposed to be. But here is where the contradiction starts to bite. Outside the movie theater, doctors and psychiatrists were becoming intensely interested in what actually happened inside the suburban bedroom. In the years after World War II, a wave of concern swept through the medical establishment. Divorce rates had spiked after the war. Marriage counselors reported a growing number of couples who were unhappy, disconnected, and confused about why their perfect suburban lives felt hollow. Experts zeroed in on a single culprit: female sexual dysfunction. The label they used was frigidity, and the definition of this condition was breathtakingly broad. A frigid woman was one who failed to achieve vaginal orgasm during intercourse with her husband. She might be affectionate. She might be a devoted mother. She might keep an immaculate house and host excellent dinner parties. But if she did not respond to her husband's advances with the proper physical enthusiasm, if she did not reach climax through penetration alone, if she required any kind of stimulation that fell outside the narrow bounds of what was considered normal marital congress, then she was diagnosed as pathological. Not difficult, not tired, not understimulated, sick. Medical journals from the period show an astonishing level of certainty about this. Psychiatrists like Dr. Edmund Bergler wrote entire books on the subject, declaring that frigidity was the emotional plague of the age. He claimed that up to 80% of women suffered from some degree of the condition, though his methodology for reaching that number was never made clear. Other physicians offered treatments that ranged from the merely humiliating to the outright dangerous. Some recommended pelvic massage administered by a doctor, a practice that was presented as strictly therapeutic but which existed in a deeply uncomfortable gray zone. Some prescribed tranquilizers to help the wife relax enough to perform. Some suggested psychotherapy to uncover the repressed childhood trauma that must be causing her unnatural resistance to marital intimacy. The underlying assumption, repeated in textbook after textbook, was that a healthy woman should find complete satisfaction in the act of being penetrated by her husband, and that any deviation from this model was evidence of deep psychological disturbance. What makes this even more striking is how recently the official story had been different. In the 1920s and 30s, a surprising number of marriage manuals emphasized mutual pleasure. Books like Theodore van de Velde's Ideal Marriage, published in 1926, became international bestsellers by arguing that both husband and wife should experience orgasm, and that the husband bore the responsibility of learning how to awaken his wife's sexuality. These earlier guides were explicit, sometimes shockingly so by later standards. They discussed foreplay, they acknowledged the clitoris. They insisted that a considerate lover would make sure his partner was satisfied before he pursued his own climax. Then World War II ended. The soldiers came home, and something shifted. The same publishing industry that had once encouraged men to be patient and attentive lovers now produced books that put the burden squarely back on women. If she was not fulfilled, the problem was her own maladjustment. The husband's technique was no longer the question. The wife's psyche was. The suburban wife of 1953 found herself trapped in a complex web of impossible expectations. She was supposed to be sexually available at all times, because refusing her husband was itself a kind of failure, a sign that she was cold, ungenerous, unwomanly. She was supposed to respond with visible pleasure, because a husband's ego demanded the reassurance that he was a skilled lover, even if no one had ever taught him anything about female anatomy. She was supposed to achieve orgasm, preferably simultaneously with her husband, from vaginal penetration alone, because psychoanalytic theory, heavily influenced by Sigmund Freud, taught that the vaginal orgasm was the mature, healthy form of female response, while the clitoral orgasm was a sign of immaturity, possibly even neurosis. The fact that the majority of women do not regularly orgasm from penetration alone was dismissed as inconvenient. If the data did not match the theory, it was the women who were broken, not the theory. And while all of this was swirling through the medical journals and the marriage manuals, the physical realities of women's lives were grinding forward with their own relentless logic. Contraception was difficult to obtain and legally restricted in many places. The birth control pill was still a decade away. The diaphragm and the condom existed, but they required access to a doctor or a pharmacy willing to dispense them, and many were not. In some states, it was illegal to provide contraception even to married couples. A young wife could expect to spend roughly 3 decades of her life in a continuous cycle of pregnancy, childbirth, and recovery. The typical family of the 1950s was larger than any generation before or since. The baby boom was not just a catchy name. A woman might have 3, 4, 5 children, each one arriving less than 2 years after the last. Her body was never entirely her own. Her nights were interrupted by infants. Her energy was consumed by laundry, cooking, cleaning, and the emotional labor of keeping a household running while her husband worked long hours. By the time she climbed into her separate twin bed at the end of the day, the idea of performing enthusiastic passion for a man who had been trained to believe her pleasure was automatic must have felt like one more impossible chore on a list that never ended. The Cold War made all of this even stranger. The American family was not just a private arrangement. It was a weapon in a global ideological struggle. Government propaganda films drew sharp contrasts between the freedom of American women to choose their own husbands and furnish their own homes, and the dreary collectivism of Soviet life, where women were forced into factories and children were raised by the state. The suburban housewife was held up as proof that capitalism was superior to communism. Her gleaming kitchen, her well-dressed children, her attentive husband, all of it was supposed to demonstrate that the American way produced happiness, stability, and moral superiority. In this context, any crack in the facade of the happy American marriage was not merely a personal sadness. It was a potential national security vulnerability. If American families were falling apart behind closed doors, then the communists were winning. This is not an exaggeration. Congressional committees in the 1950s investigated sex researchers, accusing them of weakening American morality and thereby aiding the communist cause. The bedroom had become a battlefield in the Cold War, and the women inside it were expected to be both perfect soldiers and perfect victims. And so, by the early 1950s, you have a situation unlike anything before or since. Millions of American women are living in identical suburban houses, raising their children according to the latest psychological theories, keeping their kitchens spotless, and lying awake in their twin beds at night, trying to figure out why they feel so desperately lonely. They have been told that sexual fulfillment is their husband's reward for a hard day's work, not something they should expect for themselves. They have been told that if they do not respond with automatic joy, they are suffering from a medical condition that requires professional treatment. They have been told that the survival of Western civilization depends in some vague but important way on their ability to smile and submit and never, ever complain. And they have been told all of this by men, doctors, magazine editors, politicians, filmmakers, who have never once asked them what they actually felt, what they actually wanted, what was actually happening in the dark. But here is the twist that changes everything. Some of these women were not content to stay silent. They started writing letters. They found an address for a soft-spoken biologist at Indiana University who had already made a name for himself by asking uncomfortable questions about male sexuality. His first report, published in 1948, had revealed that American men were doing all sorts of things they were not supposed to admit to, and the country had survived the shock, barely. Now, he was turning his attention to women. He had assembled a team of interviewers trained to ask detailed, specific questions without judgment, and he was collecting the largest database of female sexual experience that had ever existed. Thousands of women, eventually nearly 6,000, sat down in private rooms and answered hundreds of questions about every aspect of their intimate lives. What they had done before marriage, what they did in marriage, what they thought about when they were alone, what they actually felt, physically and emotionally, when they were with their husbands. The interviews were coded, anonymized, and compiled into statistical tables that would, when finally published, detonate under the foundation of the entire 1950s consensus. The woman reading about this in a magazine, the one who had never spoken a word of her own disappointment to anyone, not her mother, not her doctor, not her husband, saw something in that news story that made her heart beat faster. She realized she was not the only one. She realized there was a man in Indiana who wanted to hear the truth, who had built an entire scientific project around the radical idea that women's experiences mattered. She realized that if enough women told their stories, the official picture of happy suburban bedrooms might shatter under the weight of its own lies. And so she sat down at her kitchen table after the children were in bed and the dishes were done, and she began to write. "Dear Dr. Kinsey," she wrote, "I have never told anyone this before." And when she sealed that envelope and dropped it in the mailbox on the corner, she became part of something much larger than herself. The truth was gathering, and it was about to speak. In August of 1953, the book that millions of women had been waiting for, whether they knew it or not, finally landed. It was a heavy volume, over 800 pages, filled with charts and tables and the kind of clinical language that normally guarantees a quiet academic life and zero public attention. The title was Sexual Behavior in the Human Female. The author was Alfred C. Kinsey, a professor of zoology at Indiana University who had spent his early career studying gall wasps. Nothing about this package should have set the country on fire. But within days of publication, the book was impossible to find. Bookstores sold out in hours. Waiting lists stretched for months. Women, who had never purchased anything more scandalous than a ladies' home journal, were walking into shops and quietly asking for a copy, then carrying it home wrapped in brown paper, tucking it into a drawer beneath their folded nightgowns, and reading it in the stolen hours when husbands were at work and children were at school. The contents of this book were radical, not because they were salacious, though plenty of critics would later claim that, but because they were honest. For the first time in American history, someone had simply asked thousands of women what they actually did and what they actually felt, and then published the answers without moralizing, without filtering, and without pretending that the results matched the official story. The numbers were stunning. Kinsey's team reported that a quarter of married women had experienced extramarital intercourse by age 40. About half had engaged in premarital sex. Nearly 2/3 had masturbated, and of those who did, almost all of them reached orgasm, typically within minutes. This last statistic was a direct assault on the central medical dogma of the era. The doctors had been telling women that the vaginal orgasm, achieved exclusively through penetration, was the only legitimate form of female pleasure. But Kinsey's data showed something entirely different. The majority of women in his sample did not regularly have orgasm from intercourse alone. Many required direct clitoral stimulation, either from their own hands, their partner's hands, or other forms of contact. The clitoris, not the vagina, was the anatomical center of female pleasure, and the women themselves were reporting this clearly, consistently, and in numbers too large to dismiss. The medical establishment reacted as if someone had set fire to the lecture hall. Within months, prominent physicians were lining up to denounce the findings. Some called Kinsey a fraud and demanded his data, confident that any honest review would expose his errors. Others went further, accusing him of deliberately undermining American morality. One critic wrote that Kinsey had constructed a fantastically topsy-turvy world in which neurosis was declared health and health was pronounced a fantasy. The underlying fear was barely disguised. If women were naturally capable of pleasure through means other than intercourse with their husbands, then the entire framework of female sexuality as a passive, responsive, husband-dependent function was built on a lie. And if that framework collapsed, what else might crumble with it? The authority of doctors, the structure of marriage, the suburban family itself. Newspapers and magazines picked up the story and turned it into a national obsession. Life magazine, the most mainstream publication in America, devoted a long feature to the report, summarizing its findings in careful language but leaving no doubt about the scale of the revelation. Radio hosts discussed it. Sermons were preached against it. At dinner parties in Levittown and Shaker Heights and every other suburb, where identical houses sat in neat rows, couples who had never spoken frankly about sex suddenly found themselves in awkward conversations sparked by a book they might not have read, but had definitely heard about. For many husbands, the report was threatening. It suggested that their wives might have desires and capacities that the marriage manuals had never mentioned. For wives, the effect was more complicated. Some felt validated. The statistics told them they were not alone, not broken, not frigid at all, just normal women whose bodies had been lied about by an entire culture. Others felt a new kind of anxiety. If the old rules were wrong, what were the new rules? If pleasure mattered, how was a woman supposed to ask for it when she had been trained since girlhood to pretend she did not have any such needs? The letters arrived at Kinsey's office by the thousands. Women wrote from every state, from small towns and big cities, from farmhouses and suburban bungalows. The letters came on stationery scented with perfume, on torn notebook paper, on the backs of grocery lists. Some were typed and formal, others scrawled in pencil late at night. The writers ranged from elderly grandmothers who had waited their entire lives for someone to ask, to young brides who were already desperate and confused after only a few months of marriage. One woman wrote that she had been married for 12 years and had never once experienced what the book described. She had assumed she was defective. Her doctor had told her the same thing. She had been considering electroshock therapy, a treatment that some psychiatrists were actually recommending for frigidity in this era, before a friend slipped her a copy of the Kinsey report. Now she was writing to say thank you, to say that, for the first time in her life, she understood that her body was not the problem. Another letter came from a woman who had been prescribed what doctors called pelvic massage therapy, a euphemistic treatment in which a physician manually stimulated a female patient to orgasm, ostensibly to cure her inability to respond to her husband. This practice genuinely existed in the mid-20th century, a holdover from Victorian medical traditions, now dressed up in psychiatric language. The woman wrote that the treatment had been humiliating and confusing, and that reading Kinsey's book had given her the language to understand why. She was not malfunctional. She was simply a woman who needed more than her husband had ever been taught to provide. The letters piled up in filing cabinets, a gigantic archive of private pain that confirmed, in far more vivid terms than any statistical table, exactly what was wrong with the 1950s bedroom. But the backlash was gathering speed as well. The Cold War logic that had turned the American family into a patriotic institution now turned Kinsey into a national security threat. In 1954, just a year after the female report was published, a congressional committee, led by Representative B. Carol Reese, launched an investigation into tax-exempt foundations, including the Rockefeller Foundation, which had funded Kinsey's research. The committee's report suggested that Kinsey's work was part of a broader conspiracy to weaken American moral fiber and make the country vulnerable to communist subversion. The accusation was as absurd as it sounds, but in the fevered atmosphere of the early 1950s, it carried real weight. The Rockefeller Foundation withdrew its funding. Kinsey's ability to continue his research was crippled. The message to any future researcher who might consider studying female sexuality, honestly, was unmistakable. If you ask women what they actually feel, you will be destroyed. Meanwhile, in the suburbs, the twin beds stayed. The magazines kept publishing articles about wifely duty and the importance of looking pretty when your husband came home. The doctors kept diagnosing women with frigidity and prescribing treatments that ranged from useless to traumatic. But a crack had formed in the foundation, and through that crack, something was spreading. Women who had read the book, or just read about the book, started talking to each other. Quiet conversations over coffee, while the children played in the yard. Whispers at the supermarket, at church socials, at the hair salon. The information moved through female networks the way forbidden knowledge always moves. Hand to hand, voice to voice, mother to daughter, friend to friend. The official culture had told women that their sexual selves belonged to their husbands, that pleasure was not their concern, that silence and compliance were the highest virtues. But once you know you are not alone, once you know the experts have been wrong, once you know that millions of other women have been lying awake in their twin beds, feeling exactly the way you feel, you can never unknow it. And the anger that had been buried under decades of polite smiles was starting to stir. The anger did not announce itself with a roar. In the mid-1950s, it moved in whispers, in the careful exchange of dog-eared copies of the Kinsey report, in the knowing glances between women at PTA meetings, who had both spent the previous night lying rigid in their twin beds while their husbands snored across the nightstand divide. The anger was there, but it had no public language, no movement, no permission. What it had was a growing body of private evidence that the official story was a fiction, and the keepers of the official story knew it. Their response was not to change the story. Their response was to attack the evidence and silence the women who provided it. The medical counterattack on Kinsey and his findings was methodical and vicious. In the years following the publication of the female report, prominent psychiatrists and physicians published a torrent of critiques, many of which sidestepped the data entirely and went straight for the character of the researcher himself. Kinsey was accused of encouraging promiscuity, of corrupting the young, of being a sexual deviant in his own private life. The fact that he was married with children and had spent 20 years studying insects before turning his attention to human behavior was either ignored or twisted into evidence of something sinister. A man who could spend 2 decades cataloging the genitalia of millions of gall wasps was clearly not normal. The implications were plain. The findings could be dismissed because the man was a pervert. The women who had answered his questions, by extension, were either liars or tramps. The respectable suburban wife, who had poured out her heart in a 10-page letter, suddenly found herself grouped, by implication, with sex workers and adulterers. And yet the most damaging counterattack came not from individual critics, but from the long arm of the state. The Reese Committee hearings of 1954 were nominally an investigation into the tax-exempt status of charitable foundations. In practice, They were a show trial designed to discredit Kinsey and anyone associated with his work. Witnesses were paraded before the committee to testify that the Kinsey reports were part of a communist plot to destroy American family life. The logic was, as tortured as it was pervasive, the communists wanted to weaken America. The American family was the foundation of American strength. Kinsey's data suggested American families were not as pure as advertised. Therefore, Kinsey was helping the communists. That the data came from American women themselves, and that suppressing the truth was arguably more destabilizing than acknowledging it, was not a counterargument anyone in power was willing to hear. The Rockefeller Foundation, which had funded Kinsey's research for years, received the message loud and clear. In 1954, it terminated his grant. Other potential funders took note and kept their distance. The largest scientific study of human sexuality ever attempted was effectively shut down, not because the science was flawed, but because the conclusions were unacceptable. This had immediate and devastating consequences for the women whose stories had made the study possible. The project had planned to expand into an institute that would provide counseling, education, and continued research. Instead, Kinsey's team was forced to scale back, turning away thousands of women who wrote in seeking help. The letters kept coming for years, and each one was answered by a small, overworked staff with what resources they had. But the capacity to offer real assistance, to build the kind of public health infrastructure that the data cried out for, was gone. The women who had finally found someone who believed them were abandoned to the same medical system that had spent decades calling them broken. And that medical system, emboldened by the official repudiation of Kinsey, grew more aggressive in its treatments. This is the point where the story takes a genuinely dark turn. The label of frigidity, already elastic enough to cover any woman who did not fit the narrow model of vaginal responsiveness, now expanded to include women who had read Kinsey and started asking questions. A wife who requested a different kind of touch, who mentioned the word clitoris, who expressed any dissatisfaction with the standard script, risked being sent to a psychiatrist who would diagnose her with any number of pathologies: hysteria, neurosis, latent homosexuality, penis envy. The treatments escalated accordingly. In the 1950s, electroconvulsive therapy was prescribed for severe depression, but also for what doctors considered sexual dysfunction. There are documented cases of women receiving electroshock specifically to cure their resistance to marital intercourse. The theory was that the shock would disrupt the maladaptive thought patterns that prevented them from submitting willingly and happily. The reality was a nightmare of memory loss, personality change, and deep trauma, all for the crime of not wanting to have sex on demand. Other treatments were less dramatic, but equally invasive. Hormone injections were administered to boost libido, with little understanding of endocrinology and no regard for side effects. Some women were prescribed heavy tranquilizers, the first generation of what would become the billion-dollar pharmaceutical industry. Miltown, the original blockbuster tranquilizer, hit the market in 1955 and was marketed directly to housewives. The ads showed a smiling woman holding a bottle of pills, the caption reading something like, "For the tense, nervous housewife, Miltown helps you cope with the pressures of modern living." By the late 1950s, millions of prescriptions were being written annually. The suburban housewife was increasingly a woman on medication, chemically soothed into accepting the unacceptable. The Valium era was just around the corner. The pharmaceutical solution to female misery was profitable, clean, and required no changes whatsoever from husbands or society at large. If you could look beneath the surface of any suburban street in 1957, you would see the human cost of this system in vivid detail. The kitchens were clean, the children were well dressed, the lawns were mowed, and the women inside those houses were falling apart. Divorce was legally possible, but socially catastrophic, especially for a woman with no independent income and no work history beyond a few years as a secretary before marriage. The stigma of being a divorced woman was so intense that many women stayed in marriages where they were miserable, where the sex was coercive or joyless, or both, where the loneliness was crushing, because the alternative was poverty and social death. The few who did leave often found themselves in a workforce that paid women a fraction of what men earned, with no childcare, no support, and the constant message that they had failed at their most fundamental duty. And yet, amid all this, the underground network of information continued to grow. The Kinsey report had planted a seed, and even after the official backlash, that seed could not be entirely killed. In Britain, a similar awakening was happening in parallel. Dr. Joan Mollison, a pioneering physician who worked at a birth control clinic in London, began offering sexual counseling to women in the 1950s. The sessions were recorded, and decades later, researchers at Cambridge University discovered the tapes. On them, you can hear the voices of ordinary British women, their accents ranging from posh to working class, describing their experiences in words that still carry a punch across the decades. One woman says, "I feel so frigid. I feel I am failing him a great deal." Another explains that intercourse is painful, that she cannot relax, that it is not physical. It is in her mind. Mollison listened. She prescribed not shock therapy or tranquilizers, but, in some cases, very practical anatomical advice and, in others, permission to explore one's own body. She was part of a small, quiet counter-tradition that kept alive the idea that women's pleasure mattered, even as the mainstream continued to insist it did not. By the end of the 1950s, the contradictions had become unsustainable. The official culture celebrated the housewife as the queen of her domain. Advertisements showed her in pearls and heels, vacuuming the living room with a smile. Politicians praised her as the backbone of the nation. The twin beds remained in the catalogs. The marriage manuals continued to instruct wives to put their husbands' needs first. But the gap between the image and the reality had grown so wide that it could no longer be ignored. More and more women were asking the forbidden questions. Why was sex something that happened to them rather than with them? Why were their bodies such a mystery to the men who shared their beds? Why was the entire medical profession so invested in telling them they were sick, when all the evidence suggested they were simply normally human? The wave was building, and it would not be held back forever. In 1960, an event occurred that would change the calculus entirely. The Food and Drug Administration approved the first oral contraceptive, Enovid, for use as birth control. For the first time in human history, a woman could control her own fertility with a pill that required no cooperation from a man and no awkward visit to a doctor for a fitting. The impact on the suburban bedroom was not immediate but seismic. A woman who could plan her pregnancies was a woman who could imagine a life beyond endless childbearing. A woman who could have sex without the constant fear of another pregnancy was a woman who could begin to ask whether the sex itself was satisfying. The pill was not widely available to unmarried women until the late 1960s, but for married women, it started a slow revolution. By 1962, over 1 million American women were taking it. They were not all suburban housewives, but many were, and the conversation in the kitchen and the bedroom was starting to shift in ways that no one could fully control. The year 1963 brought the next explosion. Betty Friedan, a former magazine writer and suburban housewife herself, published The Feminine Mystique. The book began with a survey Friedan had conducted at her 15-year college reunion, asking her classmates about their lives. What she found was a generation of educated women who were deeply unhappy, who felt guilty about their unhappiness because they had everything they were supposed to want, and who could not name the source of their discontent. Friedan gave it a name, the problem that has no name. She traced the problem from the magazines to the medical schools to the advertising industry, showing how a systematic campaign had convinced women that their only fulfillment lay in domesticity. Sex was part of the picture. Friedan wrote about the married woman who was merely a sexual object to her husband, who was told that her passivity was natural, who was kept ignorant of her own capacity for pleasure. The book sold millions of copies. It was read in the same kitchens where Kinsey had been read a decade earlier, and it connected the private misery of the bedroom to the larger structure of a society built on keeping women small. The twin beds, those symbols of mid-century restraint, began to disappear. By the mid-1960s, department stores were advertising double and queen-sized beds as the new normal. The Hays Code, which had kept married couples apart on screen for 3 decades, finally collapsed in 1968, replaced by the modern rating system. Movies began to show husbands and wives sharing a bed, touching, kissing, implying a kind of intimacy that had been literally invisible to a generation of Americans. The change was not just cosmetic. It reflected a deeper shift in the understanding of marriage and sexuality. The women who had read Kinsey in secret, who had written letters to strangers in Indiana, who had taken tranquilizers to numb the pain of their loneliness, were now beginning to speak openly. They were joining consciousness-raising groups. They were reading feminist books. They were demanding that their husbands learn what Kinsey's most ordinary female interviewee already knew, that women were not passive vessels but active partners with desires and needs of their own. But the story does not end with a simple triumph. The legacy of the 1950s bedroom was far more complicated than a straightforward march from repression to liberation. The damage done to millions of women and to the marriages they inhabited could not be undone by a pill or a bestseller or a change in furniture fashion. Many of those marriages ended in divorce as the new expectations collided with old habits. Many women who had spent decades suppressing their own needs found it impossible to reclaim a sexuality they had never been allowed to develop. The men, too, were caught in the transition. They had been raised to believe that their wives' sexual response would be automatic, that their own technique was irrelevant, that any problem was a defect in the woman. Now, they were being told the opposite, and the learning curve was steep and often painful. The bedroom, which should have been a place of connection, had become a battlefield on which 2 damaged scripts fought for control, and no one emerged unscathed. And so, as the 1960s gave way to the 1970s, and the sexual revolution moved from the margins to the mainstream, the generation of women who had been young brides in the 1950s found themselves looking back at a lost era. Some of them had made the transition successfully, had found a new language for their desires and a new partner willing to learn. Others had not. They had spent the best years of their lives in twin beds, performing a script they never wrote, and they knew that something precious had been taken from them that they could never get back. The question that hung over their memories, and that still hangs over our understanding of that era today, was this: what had the whole elaborate apparatus of repression actually been for? Who had benefited from a society that told women their pleasure did not matter, that labeled them sick for asking for more, that medicated them into compliance and punished those who resisted? And what might have been different if someone had simply told the truth from the beginning? To understand who benefited from the system that told women their pleasure did not matter, you have to follow the money and the power. The beneficiaries were not secret conspirators, but they were real, and they were powerful, and they had every incentive to keep the structure intact. First among them were the doctors and psychiatrists who built entire careers on the diagnosis and treatment of so-called frigidity. For a physician in the 1950s, a female patient who admitted to sexual dissatisfaction was a long-term revenue stream. She would return for counseling sessions, for hormone injections, for checkups, for the pelvic massage therapy that was euphemistically described in medical literature as a standard intervention. She was a customer, not in the way she would be today as an empowered healthcare consumer, but as a captive market whose only alternative was silence. The more the diagnosis was normalized, the more patients appeared and the more the profession could claim expertise over an entire domain of human experience that had previously been private. The medicalization of female sexuality was, in economic terms, a massive expansion of the market. And the insistence that vaginal orgasm was the only healthy form of female response was, from an institutional perspective, extremely convenient. It kept the doctor in the position of authority. It kept the husband's ego protected, and it kept the wife dependent on both. The pharmaceutical industry was next in line, and its stake in the unhappiness of suburban housewives would only grow larger with time. The tranquilizer revolution of the 1950s was not an accident. Milltown, the first blockbuster anti-anxiety medication, was released in 1955 and marketed directly to the women who were told they were failing at their most important job. The advertisements are artifacts of a particular kind of cynicism. A smiling woman, hair perfectly curled, holding a bottle of pills. The text explains that she used to be nervous, irritable, unable to cope with the demands of running a household. Now she is calm. Now she is pleasant. Now her husband looks forward to coming home. The message was double-edged. On one hand, it offered relief from genuine suffering. On the other, it framed that suffering as a personal failure rather than a structural one, and it offered a chemical solution that required no change in the woman's circumstances. She did not need a husband who helped with the children. She did not need a doctor who believed her. She did not need a society that recognized her as a full human being. She needed a pill. By the early 1960s, Valium had replaced Milltown as the most prescribed drug in America, and the suburban housewife remained its ideal customer. The tranquilizer era was not a response to female misery. It was a monetization of it. Then there were the husbands. This is the most uncomfortable part of the ledger, because it requires acknowledging that millions of ordinary men who were not monsters, men who loved their wives in the only way they had been taught, were also beneficiaries of the system. The marriage manuals of the post-war era did not just instruct women to submit. They instructed men that their wives would respond automatically if they were normal, that foreplay was mostly unnecessary, that a woman's orgasm was a sign of his virility rather than a shared goal. The husband who had read such manuals, who had grown up with the Hays Code and the twin beds and the locker room talk that divided women into wives and others, entered the bedroom with a script that demanded very little of him and promised everything in return. If his wife was unsatisfied, the problem was hers, not his. The medical establishment backed him up on this. His ego was protected. His sense of himself as a competent lover was never challenged because any evidence to the contrary was filtered through the diagnosis of female pathology. The system worked beautifully for him, at least on the surface, and the cost was borne entirely by the woman lying awake on the other side of the nightstand. The political establishment had its own investment in the mythology of the satisfied housewife. The Cold War was, as we have seen, a war of images as much as missiles. The American family was the banner under which the nation marched into ideological battle with the Soviet Union. A happy wife, a productive husband, well-adjusted children. This was the living proof that capitalism delivered the good life. Any crack in that image was not just a private sadness but a propaganda liability. When Kinsey published his data, he was not just challenging medical orthodoxy. He was handing the Soviets a propaganda tool, or so the logic went, by revealing that American women were not as fulfilled as the official narrative claimed. The Reese Committee's investigation of his funding was not really about tax law. It was about damage control. The system needed the housewife to be happy because her happiness was a national asset. Her unhappiness was a state secret. And so the institutions of government, from congressional committees to the FBI's quiet surveillance of sex researchers, aligned themselves with the forces that wanted the truth to stay buried. But the largest beneficiary, in a sense, was the culture itself. The ideology of female sexual passivity was not just a set of rules. It was a foundation stone for a much larger edifice of gender relations. If women were naturally less interested in sex than men, then all the other inequalities followed logically. Men needed careers because they had stronger drives that required sublimation into work. Women needed homes because their weaker drives were best expressed through nurturing. Men made decisions because they were rational. Women deferred because they were emotional. The bedroom was where this entire framework was either confirmed or challenged every single night. A woman who knew her own body, who understood what gave her pleasure, who could articulate her desires and expect them to be met, was not just a better lover. She was a threat to the entire social order, because a woman who could say what she wanted in bed might start saying what she wanted at the dinner table, in the voting booth, in the workplace. The containment of female sexuality was the containment of female power, and the twin beds were its most visible symbol. Given all of this, the real question is not why the system existed, but why it ever cracked. The answer lies in the women themselves, and in the slow accumulation of evidence that could not be permanently suppressed. The Kinsey Report was the most spectacular breach in the wall, but it was not the only one. In the years that followed, thousands of women who had never spoken a word of their private disappointment began to find their voices, not in the public square, but in small gatherings, in letters to each other, in whispered conversations across back fences. The consciousness-raising groups of the 1960s and 70s would later be credited with waking women up to the political dimensions of their personal lives. But those groups were built on a foundation that had been laid by the housewives of the 1950s, the ones who read Kinsey in secret, who wrote him letters, who passed their dog-eared copies to their neighbors and said, "You are not crazy, you are not broken, you are not alone." The transformation did not happen evenly. For every woman who found liberation in the new ideas, there was another who could not make the leap. The generation that had married in the 1940s and 50s had invested their entire identities in the role that was now being dismantled. To admit that the role was a cage would be to admit that they had wasted their lives, or worse, that they had been complicit in their own oppression. Some women responded with anger, not at the system, but at the younger feminists who seemed to be mocking everything they had sacrificed. Other women simply withdrew, medicating their pain with the tranquilizers that were still being prescribed in enormous quantities, or with alcohol, which became an increasingly common coping mechanism behind the closed doors of the suburbs. The Betty Friedan stereotype of the housewife who drinks alone in the afternoon was not entirely a myth. Yet the change, once set in motion, could not be reversed. The twin beds that had once been a mark of modern sophistication became, by the late 1960s, a symbol of emotional distance and repressed misery. Furniture manufacturers had already begun shifting their marketing toward larger beds, and by the early 1970s, the queen-sized mattress was the new standard for marital bedrooms. Department stores that had once advertised his and hers twin sets now showed couples sharing a single bed, sometimes even touching, an image that would have been unthinkable just 15 years earlier. The Hays Code, which had kept married couples apart on screen since the 1930s, finally gave way to the modern MPAA rating system in 1968, and within a few years, films were showing levels of intimacy that would have horrified the censors of the previous era. The visual language of American marriage had shifted, and the physical arrangements of actual marriages shifted with it. But here is a surprising detail that rarely makes it into the standard narrative of this transformation. For all the cultural power of the twin beds as a symbol of repression, they were not, in reality, as universal as the period's own propaganda suggested. Working-class families who could not afford the extra furniture or the larger bedrooms required for twin beds had always been more likely to share a bed. The twin bed was, in many ways, a middle-class status symbol, a sign that you had achieved a level of prosperity and refinement that permitted separate sleeping arrangements. And even among the middle class, many couples quietly ignored the official arrangement. The twin beds might be photographed for the magazine's spread, but at night they were pushed together, or one partner crossed the gap to the other mattress, and what happened after that was nobody's business but theirs. The image of twin beds was always, to some degree, a performance, a public face that concealed a more complicated private reality. This is true of so much of the 1950s mythology. The surface was perfectly maintained, but underneath, people were improvising, breaking the rules, finding their own way to something like happiness. One couple who never performed the performance were Alfred and Clara Kinsey. Their marriage, which lasted from 1921 until Alfred's death in 1956, was by all accounts a genuine partnership of equals. Clara had been one of his graduate students, a brilliant scientist in her own right, and she became his closest collaborator on the sex research project. She was one of the interviewers who traveled the country, collecting the thousands of life histories that formed the backbone of the reports. She understood the work not just intellectually, but personally. Their own relationship was unconventional in ways that would have shocked their suburban neighbors. They shared a bed, for one thing, and they were honest with each other about their desires and experiences in a manner that was virtually unheard of in their generation. Kinsey once said that his research had begun, in part, with questions about his own marriage, and Clara had been willing to help him find the answers. They were not perfect. No marriage is, but they represented an alternative model, a glimpse of what could be possible when two people approached each other with honesty instead of a script. The Kinseys did not have a twin-bedroom set, and yet the vast majority of couples in the 1950s were not the Kinseys. They were people who had been given no language for honesty, no permission for curiosity, and every incentive to keep up the performance even when it was killing them. The letters that continued to arrive at the Institute for Sex Research long after the funding was cut told the same stories over and over. Women who had been married for 20 years and never once experienced pleasure. Women who had been through electroshock and hormone injections and years of psychotherapy, all for the crime of not being able to orgasm from penetration alone. Women who had been told by their doctors to just relax, to just submit, to just try harder, as if desire could be summoned by an act of will. Women who had come to believe that there was something fundamentally wrong with them, something that no amount of prayer or medicine or effort could fix. And then, in their letters, the sudden flood of relief, the realization, sparked by a single book, that they were normal after all. The tragedy is that this realization came so late for so many of them. A woman who married at 20 and discovered Kinsey at 40 had already spent 2 decades believing she was broken. That is 20 years of shame and confusion that no late-arriving truth can ever fully undo. The daughters of these women grew up in a different world, and this created its own complications. The young women who came of age in the late 60s and early 70s, the first generation for whom the pill was widely available and the feminist movement was a visible force, often had complicated relationships with their mothers. They could see, sometimes with uncomfortable clarity, that their mothers were unhappy, that the silent bargain of the 1950s had not worked. But they could not always understand why their mothers had accepted it, or why they resisted their daughters' attempts to challenge it. The generation gap was a bedroom gap as much as anything else. A mother who had never once spoken openly about sex with her husband could not easily have such conversations with her daughter. A mother who had been raised to believe that pleasure was not her concern could not suddenly become an advocate for her daughter's sexual liberation. And so the silence was passed down, not as instruction, but as a wound, a gap in the transmission of knowledge that each generation had to fill in for itself. By the time the feminist movements of the 1970s began to institutionalize the insights that individual women had been discovering on their own, the original generation of 1950s housewives was aging. Some of them joined the movement, finding in late middle age a community that finally validated what they had always suspected. Many more did not. They watched from the sidelines as their daughters and granddaughters claimed freedoms they had never been offered, and their feelings were complicated: pride, envy, grief, sometimes resentment. The sexual revolution, for all its real achievements, was not kind to women who had spent their lives in the old dispensation. It seemed to tell them that their sacrifices had been for nothing, that they had been dupes, that their entire experience was a cautionary tale. Even the language of liberation could be a kind of condemnation. The most heartbreaking accounts from this period come from the therapists and counselors who worked with older women in the 1980s and 90s. By then, the word frigidity had been removed from the diagnostic manuals, replaced by more specific and less judgmental language. The old treatments, the electroshock and the hormone injections and the pelvic massage therapy, had been recognized as ineffective at best and abusive at worst. But the women who had lived through them were still there, still carrying the scars. Some of them had never recovered a capacity for pleasure. The pathways had been conditioned too thoroughly, the associations too deeply ingrained. Sex would always be, for them, a duty performed under the shadow of a diagnosis. They had been told they were broken for so long that the truth, when it finally arrived, could not set them free. They could understand intellectually that they were normal, but their bodies had learned a different lesson, and bodies do not unlearn as easily as minds. And yet there are also stories of resilience, of women who made the transition despite everything. The letters to Kinsey contain not just pain but hope. Some of the women who wrote to him went on to have difficult but productive conversations with their husbands. Some marriages ended, and the women found new partners with whom they could finally, in their 50s or 60s, experience the mutuality they had been denied. Some marriages survived and even improved as the couples worked their way through the wreckage of the old expectations and built something new. These stories are less dramatic than the horror stories, and they have been less often told, but they are just as real. The human capacity to adapt, to heal, to learn, should never be underestimated. The generation that was taught that pleasure was not their concern produced, in the end, some of the most articulate advocates for pleasure the world has ever known. They had to learn the hard way, but they learned. What, then, would have been different if someone had simply told the truth from the beginning? If the marriage manuals had honestly described female anatomy, if the movies had shown couples sharing a bed with genuine affection, if the doctors had listened to their patients instead of diagnosing them, if the culture had accepted women as sexual beings with desires of their own, the answer is impossible to calculate with precision. But the outlines are clear. Millions of women would have been spared decades of shame. Millions of marriages would have been built on a foundation of honesty rather than scripted role play. The pharmaceutical industry might have made less money, and a certain kind of psychiatrist might have had fewer patients, and the furniture industry might have sold fewer twin beds. But the world would have been a substantially better place for the people who actually lived in it. The most important truth that emerged from the wreckage of the 1950s bedroom is one that still bears repeating. Female sexuality is not a defect to be corrected. It is not a service to be provided. It is not a passive receptacle for male desire. It is an active, complex, individual reality that belongs to each woman alone, and any society that tries to suppress it, to medicalize it, to shame it into silence, is not protecting anything except its own power. The housewives of the 1950s paid the price for their society's refusal to accept this simple fact. They paid it in loneliness, in humiliation, in unnecessary medical procedures, in years of believing they were broken when they were actually normal. Some of them never got the refund. Their suffering is a debt that can never be fully repaid, only acknowledged. And so, as we leave the bedrooms of the 1950s, with their matching nightstands and their floral wallpaper and their carefully separated marriage beds, we are left with a final image. It is late at night in a suburban development somewhere in America. The streetlights cast pools of yellow on the identical lawns. In every house, behind every picture window, a version of the same drama is playing out in silence. In one house, a woman is lying awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering why she feels so lonely when she has everything she was told to want. In the next house, a woman is reading a book by flashlight under the covers, a book that is telling her, for the first time in her life, that she is not alone. In the house across the street, a woman is writing a letter. She does not know if anyone will read it. She does not know if it will make any difference. But she is writing it anyway because the truth, once it has been spoken even in a whisper, demands to be heard. That whisper, once it left the sealed envelope and traveled through the postal system to a small office in Bloomington, Indiana, did not end its journey there. It joined tens of thousands of other whispers, other letters, other voices that had been waiting for decades to be heard. And from that accumulation, something shifted in the foundation of American life that has never quite settled back into place. The housewives who wrote those letters did not set out to start a revolution. They were not activists. They were not radicals. They were women who had been told a story about themselves that did not match their experience, and when someone finally offered them a chance to tell the truth, they took it. That is the quiet engine of every major social change. Not grand speeches or dramatic confrontations, but ordinary people who can no longer bear the gap between the official story and the life they are actually living. The 1950s suburban bedroom was, in the end, a perfect microcosm of that gap. On the surface, it was the picture of order, the matching furniture, the freshly ironed sheets, the wife in her pastel nightgown, hair pinned for bedtime, lipstick refreshed before her husband walked through the door. It was a tableau that could have been printed in any women's magazine of the era, and indeed it was printed, over and over, until it became indistinguishable from reality itself. But behind that picture was something the magazines never showed. The loneliness, the confusion, the sense of being trapped in a performance that drained you even as you slept, the medical establishment that profited from your unhappiness, the pharmaceutical industry that medicated your resistance, the political system that depended on your silence, and underneath all of it, the most intimate betrayal of all, the knowledge that your own body, the one thing that was supposed to be yours, was being defined, diagnosed, and managed by people who had never once asked you what you felt. What makes the story of the 1950s bedroom so resonant today is not that it is ancient history. It is not. The twin beds may be gone, replaced by king-sized mattresses and memory foam and whatever else the furniture industry convinces us we need. The Hays Code is a relic, and movies now show levels of intimacy that would have caused mass fainting spells in 1953. The word frigidity has been scrubbed from the diagnostic manuals, and no reputable doctor would prescribe electroshock for sexual dissatisfaction. In many ways, the world has changed so dramatically that it can be hard to remember just how constrained that earlier era was. And yet, if you listen carefully, you can still hear echoes of the same old script. The idea that female sexuality is a problem to be managed rather than a reality to be understood. The assumption that a woman's pleasure is optional, a bonus rather than a baseline expectation. The medicalization of desire, now dressed up in newer language, but still carrying some of the same old assumptions about what is normal and what is broken. Consider the conversations that are still happening right now in bedrooms all over the world. How many women still find it difficult to articulate what they want, not because they do not know, but because they were raised with the residual shame of generations who were taught never to ask. How many men still operate from a script that owes more to the marriage manuals of the 1950s than they would ever consciously admit? How many couples are still, in one way or another, performing a version of the twin bed arrangement, lying next to each other in the dark, separated not by a nightstand but by the accumulated weight of everything that has never been said? The external furniture has changed, but the internal architecture can take much longer to rebuild. The generation that came after the 1950s housewives, the baby boomers, and then Generation X, and then millennials, and now Generation Z, each inherited not just the gains of the sexual revolution, but also its unfinished business. The pill was a genuine liberation, but it also shifted the burden of contraception almost entirely onto women, a pattern that persists today. The feminist movement opened up new conversations about female pleasure, but those conversations are still contested, still vulnerable to backlash, still fighting for space in a culture that often prefers the old simplifications. The Kinsey data demonstrated conclusively that female sexuality is diverse, complex, and not reducible to a single script. But the wellness industry and social media influencers still find a market for telling women what they should want, how they should feel, what it means if they do not match the latest ideal. And then there is the deeper question that the 1950s bedroom leaves us with: A question that is not just about sex but about the nature of truth itself. The system that created the twin beds and the frigidity diagnosis and the tranquilizer prescriptions was not a conspiracy in the usual sense. There was no secret meeting where doctors and politicians and furniture manufacturers gathered to plot the subjugation of women. But there was a web of incentives that all pointed in the same direction. It was profitable for doctors to diagnose female pathology. It was politically useful for the government to project an image of happy families. It was comfortable for men to believe that their wives' pleasure was automatic and required nothing of them. It was economically advantageous for pharmaceutical companies to medicate unhappiness rather than address its causes. The system was not designed by any single villain, but it was sustained by the collective choice of everyone who benefited from it to look away from the women who were paying the price. The truth, when it arrived, did not come from within the system. It came from the outside, from a biologist who studied insects, and a team of interviewers who asked questions nobody else would ask, and from thousands of women who were willing to tell the truth when someone finally created a space where it could be heard. That is the legacy of the 1950s housewife and her secret letter. It is a reminder that the official story is always incomplete, that the people with power have incentives to distort, and that the truth often lives in the margins, in the private confessions, in the data that the authorities wish did not exist. It is also a reminder that ordinary people, armed with nothing more than their own experience and the courage to share it, can, over time, dismantle even the most entrenched systems of control. The changes did not happen all at once. They are still happening. But they began with a whisper, with a letter, with a woman who decided that her own reality mattered enough to write it down and send it into the world. As you settle back into your own bed tonight, wherever you are and whatever century you inhabit, there is a quiet invitation in this history. It is not a demand or a prescription. It is simply this: the women of the 1950s paid an enormous price to learn that silence is not protection and that the performance of happiness is not the same as the real thing. They left behind their letters, their data, their stories, so that we might not have to learn those same lessons in the same painful way. Their twin beds have been dismantled and sold for scrap. Their marriage manuals have crumbled into dust. But their voices, captured on those pages and preserved in those archives, are still speaking. The least we can do is listen. If you found yourself intrigued by this quiet corner of history, by the real stories behind the polished surface of mid-century suburban life, then you are exactly the kind of person this channel was made for. We dig into the forgotten, the hidden, the parts of the past that the textbooks gloss over, and we tell the stories of the people who live them. If you want to hear more, take a moment to subscribe, and if you are already subscribed, thank you for being part of this community of curious minds. Drop a comment and let me know what time it is where you are, and what other hidden histories you would like us to explore next. Now close your eyes, let the weight of the day fall away, and know that somewhere in Indiana, in a filing cabinet in a quiet archive, the letters are still there, and the truth they contain is still waiting to be heard.